First, let us give you hope. Your planet is not going to end in a nuclear conflagration. The 3/4 of you are not going to leave in ascension while the rest stay and, suffer misery and hell on earth. No, that's not going to happen. And as a matter of fact, there really is not going to be the departure en masse that so many have talked about or have been alluding to. In fact, though, and this is not to frighten you, this is the end times. You could absolutely accept this as the end times. But at the end times of what is the big question. It's not the end times of earthly humanity, we wish to tell you. You've been on too much of a purposeful journey throughout all of the history of your species. Because what you tend to not have a picture of is the overall divine movement behind your growth as a species. And so we would like to begin to explain how you got where you are right now. If you want to look at who you really are, because that's what you really need to understand, who is it that you really are as a humanity? Who is it that earthly humanity really is? You must go back to the time of the garden. You must go back to the time when a certain measure of consciousness, a certain level of consciousness was achieved. Now, if you go to your Bibles and use them as metaphors, the metaphors they were always intended to be, you will begin to perhaps understand some of the messages that are given. You must understand something about religion, dogma, how this all came about. In the past, you had no written language. Writing came, after many thousands of years. You developed, you could do pictures on the wall and things like that, but there was really no complex communication, no way to really transmit an idea except through oral tradition. You must understand that you lived with oral tradition back then, and oral tradition is a very alive and moving dynamic. It certainly is a dynamic that uses metaphor and uses symbol, but those metaphors and symbol change with each succeeding generation. As each generation grew more and learned more, the stories changed a little bit to adjust to the society, to adjust to the civilization at that time. And so oral tradition and the relationship that people had with the divine was an always growing, always moving dynamic. And then came writing. Now, what was the first thing? Oh, archaeologists. Where's our archaeologist? Here we go. What was the first thing that people wrote upon?
Don't know.
Stone. Right? Stone. Oh, okay. Okay, but that was the first thing that people wrote upon. Remember, that was the first languages that they found, written in stone. Because understand something, if it's written and it becomes dogma, it doesn't move, it doesn't grow, the metaphor doesn't change, and it has not moved in thousands and thousands of years appreciably. Now, that's not to say that you as individuals do not have a greater picture of it, but we're talking about the dynamic of your consensus reality, because that is a very important piece of this whole picture. So let's go back to the garden. In the garden, you had no spoken language. You were little primates. You're cute little things, long, silky red hair covered your whole bodies. You're about 3.5, 4 feet tall. And you were incredibly intelligent. You had no spoken language, but you communicated through a dynamic that is called direct cognition. How do you think animals communicate today on your planet? They communicate through a sort of telepathy. In their own language, they don't think in a linear fashion as you do, but they still think, and they still feel, and they still reason, and they still communicate with each other. You communicated in a very similar way. It was almost a super telepathy. If you wish to know about a tree, for example, You have the ability, and you still have this ability, by the way. You could actually meld your consciousness with that tree, and you would know what it meant, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to be that tree. And the added benefit was that tree got to know what it meant to be you. Now, understand, this was collective consciousness in its purest form. You were connected with each other completely, intimately. If you were hungry, food would manifest seemingly out of thin air. Why? Because there were approximately 200,000 or so of you who had the exact same wishes in the exact same moment. It was, as we said, it was collective consciousness in its truest form. There was no separation between any of you. You knew that you were loved. Do you understand? You knew who you were. You knew that you were loved. You knew that you belonged to the species as well as to the planet. There was no separation between you and each other. There was no separation between you and nature. And there was absolutely no separation between nature and spirit. It was, you were one with the all. Understand something. If you can use the metaphor of the way your body grows, you can understand how the species has grown. Okay? Just as every child moves and grows, so too did you as a species move and grow. Just as every child needs to separate from the mother, separate from the father, separate from the siblings in order to develop their own identity in their adolescence, so too did you need to separate from each other, from God got us all that is, from nature, in order to develop an identity of your own. Because is that not the purpose of adolescence? To develop an identity of your own. So it's been a very natural progression. But just as in the personal situation, when one has an adolescent wounding, it is what? It is painful. Understand, one moment you have this collective consciousness, and the next moment you're standing alone with your own little piece of the ego. It was quite a painful and traumatic event. You didn't know it was going to be that way. Understand that. You had never had those experiences before. However, again, it was very purposeful. You have, earthly humanity has an ability that most other species don't have. You have this incredible ability to love. No matter how much love you have in your lives, you always long for just a little bit more. And that is a laudable trait, we wish to tell you, dear ones. It has been the reason that you have grown as quickly as you have. And as a species, you're literally 250,000 years ahead of yourselves. All right? So in that dynamic, you, through this desire to be more, through this desire to grow, paradise becomes boring after a while. Well, it can. We realize that those of you that live in this world of competition and comparison would love paradise even for, 10 minutes, where you knew that you were one with all, where you could be sure of it in your heart and your mind without any doubts at all. And we hear you, I'm sure. But, this includes conscious and subconscious as well. In what we were talking about. Now, we don't want to confuse things because we're going to get into this. This dynamic of direct cognition, of complete oneness, then to the dynamic of separation. Now, through this dynamic of separation, you have created the paradigm that we're calling the Darwinian paradigm, for lack of a better term. You can call it a chauvinistic paradigm. It's basically a paradigm that's built on competition and comparison, on survival of the fittest. All right? And it comes from the basic belief that there's not enough in your world. That there's not enough love, that there's not enough money, that there's not enough food, that there's not enough resources, and that you have to compete with each other in order to survive. Well, in fact, that's a lie, but you must also understand this is a paradigm that is built upon fear, right? It's a dynamic that's built upon survival. And it's a paradigm that has carried you a tremendous distance. You see, we have no judgments about it. There are those in your world that have a great deal of judgment about it, some of you included, but we don't, because we see how quickly you have grown. We see, in cosmic time, 250,000 years is a nanosecond. And the leaps, just look at how far you've grown in the last 200 years. It's been amazing. And you must understand the journey has all been purposeful. So you've been through your childhood, and now you're at the end of your adolescence. You've been through this journey of competition and comparison. You have become incredibly technologically advanced. You have grown socially, emotionally, physically, in many, many ways. Spiritually, we can't say that you, as a species, have grown all that much, but the desire is there. You are about to step out of evolution, you know. Well, and that is very true, because evolution is an unconscious dynamic, isn't it? Evolution is a dynamic of growth that, you know, you don't decide, wake up tomorrow morning and decide you're going to evolve. It doesn't work like that. It's a dynamic that comes from the unconscious, a dynamic of growth. So if you look at it, you had the connection of the garden, then you move through the individuation, and now you're being asked, without losing one iota of your hard-won individuality, to reconnect with each other. So we're kind of talking about your history as a species. And we've been talking about the fact that there was a time when you existed in the garden, and that was your childhood as a species, and that there was also, you have been moving through a time of adolescence, where you have been working to gain your individuality and your own identity, just as that's what adolescence is for, isn't it? And now you stand on the verge of your adulthood as a species, where you realize that you can move beyond the evolutionary dynamic of survival of the fittest. Because that's what it is. Because aren't most of the structures in your world built upon the dynamic of survival of the fittest? In almost everything, including religion, including your concepts of, you know, of gods. So, here you are. You have been on this long journey, this long, purposeful, divine journey of consciousness, where you had a collective consciousness of the garden, where that's separated into the individual yous that are here now in your own identity, and now from this place of identity to reconnect with each other. You know, it's a funny thing. You see the changes. Most of you have been around for a while, and so we would say that you can all of you here can remember before 1980. Can you remember? Yes, you can remember before 1980. And it was a very different world, wasn't it? It was a very different world. There was much more compassion. There was much more caring. And it seemed like in 1980 or so, all of a sudden compassion went out the window. And it was purposeful. This polarity, this dynamic of polarization of energy is so purposeful right now, because each of you in your personal lives, as well as each of you in the dynamic of the whole consensus, all of these reflections are asking you one question and one question only. Who is it that you are going to be? Who is it that you are going to be as an individual, and who is it that you are going to be as a species? Will you become a civilization? A civilized society is based upon how well the least of you are doing, not how well the best are doing. That's the measure of civilization. That's where you're going. If you can just use that as for yourselves as a measure. You know, how well are the least doing? And begin to express that. You see, some are going to choose to be more, and some are not. Some are going to choose to reconnect, and some are not. Some are going to choose to change the motivation from one of fear to one of caring, one of love.